Hello. In episode 106 of Airs for Architecture, I speak with Dr. Sabina Andron, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Melbourne, about her recent book, Urban Surfaces, Graffiti and the Right to the City, published by Routledge this year.
Airs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Sabina Andron about Sabina's new book, Urban Surfaces, Graffiti and the Right to the City, Space, Materiality and the Normative, which you published recently with Routledge. Really interesting, excellent book. Sabina, before we talk about that, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, it's good to be here and to have a chat. I'm looking forward to this. So, as you said, my name is Sabina Andron. I'm talking to you today from Melbourne, which is where I moved a year ago to do a postdoc in cities and urbanism. That's my title. I'm a research fellow in cities and urbanism right now. I am a scholar, I would say, of urban visual culture. That's my main field of study, and that's what has brought together all my interests throughout the years. I have done a master's in visual culture and a PhD at the Bartlett at UCL in architectural history and theory. So I have a background that's coming from, I would say, space studies, built environment studies, but also very much looking at images. So I guess my scholarly universe has kind of coagulated around the themes of space and images. And that's where the book came from.
Are you a geographer by training or are you an architect by training?
I'm not an architect or a geographer. I go to geographers' conferences, I go to sociologists' conferences, and I always have to say, oh, but I'm not really.
Yeah.
No, I actually studied comparative literature for my undergrad. So I've had, I would say, quite an unusual trajectory. But I think a lot of the ways that I see the world and the methods I use could pertain to some of these disciplines. And therefore, I can kind of shape and present the work in such a way that, I get away with going to the sociologist conferences.
Isn't everybody welcome at a sociologist conference? Aren't they
Everyone's welcome at geographers' conferences. They're the best. Yeah. Sociologists are a bit more territorial.
Yeah, geographers are incredibly promiscuous. It's true. I've even spoken at geographers' conferences. It's they don't even cost a lot. It's true. So the book. Where does the book come from? Is this your thesis, or is this an advance on your thesis? Your doctoral thesis?
Yes. So the book was partly born out of my PhD thesis, which I did at the Bartlett. And I'm sorry, I didn't prepare. I should have brought up the title of the PhD thesis, which I can't remember now because it was very long and convoluted. And I guess
I'm gonna find it. I'm gonna find it online.
Now I just want to say the name of the book. For a semiotic, legal, and cultural theory of urban surfaces and inscriptions, but this was after the colon. I can't remember what came before the colon. It was a very long title, but it attempted to bring together a study of graffiti and street art, which is what brought me actually to the built environment. I wanted to understand what we can learn about spaces by researching the way that they are inscribed, which was a bit different from, now I can even say, traditional graffiti scholarship, because yes, there is such a thing now. It's quite a well-established field by this point. And even when I started the PhD in 2011, there had already been a considerable, I would say, body of scholarship around graffiti and street art and how it's developed historically. But most of it was sociological. It was ethnographies. It was looking at graffiti writers, their motivations, the aesthetics of it, questions of style and how it fits into an art historical lineage or not. But much less of it referred or explored the relationship of graffiti with space and the city, and the role it plays in actually making space. And that's what I wanted to do. So in fact, I kind of said I wanted to use graffiti as a method to study cities. So like, what can we learn about space and cities through graffiti? So that was the premise of the PhD, which took a very long time to complete. And
That's what they're supposed to. They're supposed to.
they're supposed to, of course. It's like my friend used to say, we were in the same PhD cohort. She said, if it doesn't break you, you're not doing it right.
Yeah, exactly. If your hands aren't bleeding, you're not bleeding trying. I think that's the Royal British Legion. No, not the Royal British Legion. The army, some form of the army.
I broke once with the thesis, with the PhD, and then I broke again with the book, because the book took 5 more years from the completion of the PhD. But okay, you have to imagine that this wasn't just me agonizing over writing or rewriting or reframing some of it. I was doing a lot of teaching, and this was evening activity essentially. So that, yeah, you know.
Yeah, you don't have to make you don't have to make you don't have to make excuses. We understand. A book is a big thing. It's a very interesting book, and I'm really interested in this background in comparative literature, because this is, for me, like, jumps out in your kind of positioning of the book, and throughout the book, this idea of the city as you say, inscribed as something to be read in a way, rather than perhaps something to be experienced or something to be aestheticized. But rather, this is very much about the city as, well, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, about the city as a kind of aspect of the textual world, I suppose.
It very much is so. And for me, this is the gift that keeps on giving, in the sense that I even now find new ways of literally reading the surfaces of the city. And these are exercises I used to do with my students, and that I perform right now as well as a research method, you know, going out and writing down all the names, or literally all the text that I can see in this stretch of 50 meters, let's say. And then examining, a bit like Georges Perec, making lists, flattening things. So examining this in a way that then doesn't necessarily, just again as an exercise, we stop differentiating between the different types of communication and signage and graphic marks and inscriptions that we see in cities all the time. And we start thinking about their quality as occupiers of space more than anything else. And so there are aesthetic considerations, but I think for me, some of the, I think, more novel contributions of the book are to do, on the one hand, like you say, with this idea of the city as text, but quite literally in the street. So not these ideas of, you know, reading the city from above or the bird's eye view or something like that. And not, so it's not the planner's perspective, right? But also the textual, but also the textural. And this is where we talk about textures, and writing has a texture too. And I think for me, this is very interesting. And in fact, I revisited, while I was finishing the book, I revisited Learning from Las Vegas, which is one of my favorite books. And I think many people would say this, many people who are in the architecture and urban world would say this. And I found this beautiful concept that they use to refer to the Las Vegas Strip and the signage on the strip. They called it a mega texture. And I thought this was a very powerful way to describe what I feel many times when I go out. I see a lot of life and activity in the textures of the city text, if that makes sense. And I think that was the space that I was interested in exploring, and that's what the book is about.
I suppose the question, not to sound too like a funder, but What drove your desire to write this thesis, this book? Was it that you yourself couldn't stop yourself and kept on scrawling all over other people's property? Or were you a writer yourself? Or were you inspired by some kind of examination of the politics, the ethics, the political aspects of it? Because it does feel timely. I mean, I noticed the first time, I suppose the first time I went to New York 20 odd years ago, I was amazed at the quantity of graffiti, but I was also amazed at the quantity of tattooing, which at that time wasn't particularly prevalent in Britain. It was something that was still more linked to working class culture and industrial culture and military culture.
Ornament and crime, huh?
Well, I don't want to come across like Adolf Loos because he was a horrible man, but that is the first time anybody's accused me of that. And now it's everywhere. Graffiti and tattooing is everywhere, and I think they are somehow connected to each other in some kind of way. But perhaps that's beyond the scope of this discussion. So yeah, what was it? Just you're noticing that this thing was happening?
You know, if I, and not to sound too much like someone who's trying to get funding, okay, but this kind of reading hasn't, and okay, when I say reading, it's the reading of the city. It hasn't really been done before, I think, because I think what this book does that is new is that it shifts attention away from graffiti as object or as artistic category, and it moves into writing method, kind of a toolkit for how we can engage with everything cities tell us through surfaces. That was long. I'll say it again. So instead of isolating specific types of inscriptions, there's so much scholarship on advertising in public space, for example, billboards, right? Or ghost signs, the old hand-painted advertising that we can see now in a very faded way, and we attribute some sort of heritage value to, right? And then graffiti and street art as well have a lot of scholarship as individual categories. But what hadn't been done before was for someone to look at how all of these types of signs and inscriptions tell us something about cities in a particular location through this particular spatial typology of the surface. So for me, the book came out of the fact that I saw this. I saw it, and then it was like a complete revelation, and it continues to be a revelation for me every day. And when I travel and when I try to develop new research projects, it is a constant lesson. I keep saying surfaces have taught me everything I know about cities. And it's a bit of like a, catchphrase, but not really, because every day I learn something from paying attention to the graphic marks and to the textures and the materialities of urban surfaces. And so, of course, the book came as a step of saying, hey, can everyone pay attention to this, please?
Yeah.
And lo and behold, it's just been out for a few months. And of course, I'm not the first one to talk about this, but I think defining surfaces, urban surfaces, as a main concept of study, a field of study, a scientific object, hasn't been done before. There have been calls before, for example, by a scholar whose work I respect dearly. His name is Andrea Brighenti, and he's a sociologist in Italy. And he proposed this idea of creating a sociology of walls and looking at what that might mean if we stop just looking at walls as barriers and like architectural material objects, and instead we understood them as well as sites of display and kind of social entities that have particular rhythms and qualities and contribute to the social dynamic of the city.
It's a very clear idea. I think it's a fascinating parallel to another area that other guests on the podcast have talked about previously, which is the idea of, in architecture, of the elevation, which is something that has receded quite considerably as a site of design thinking. Students obviously have to put together, and architects have to put together elevations of what their building looks like. But the actual way that we engage with students and in terms of their responsibility to the surface of the building has, I think, crashed in quite a major way. And possibly that's weird because it's actually how most of the public address architecture, engage with architecture. And so your study to me seems to be a parallel thing, which is to look at the unauthored or perhaps even anti-authored aspects of the surface of the city, that the surface is the principal site of the encounter with the city. And so to ignore the depth of meaning that is transcribed in it or inscripted in it is to almost miss the entirety of the city in a weird kind of way. And this is particularly true in the face of modernity, which has become more and more concerned with flatness. And the abandonment of depth.
There's such good points that you're making, and I'm going to pick up on a couple of things from what you just said. So, instead of maybe calling it anti-authored, yes, anti-authored perhaps in terms of the imprint that the architect is supposed to leave on the building in terms of a design language. But in fact, in buildings in use fact, if that makes sense, surfaces are co-authored, and that co-authorship extends far beyond human agency. And there are a few scholars right now, even from architectural history, who are looking at this and looking at how weather patina and different types of organisms and moss and so on, that weeds that grow on surfaces reveal, just like inscriptions. In fact, there are some scholars who are doing really interesting parallels between weeds and graffiti, and kind of how symbolically but also materially they signal cracks in the capitalist system and power struggles of the built environment, and also areas of opportunity and growth. And I think one of the ways in which surfaces are being treated today from a design and planning perspective is, and again, this is a modernist legacy, through trying to keep them clean, neat, and protected and securitized. So surfaces are coated in ways that many times we can't even see because these coatings are transparent, right? But they are coated to be protected against unwanted inscription, read graffiti, and to therefore maintain this aspirational, pristine character, which of course they will never have. But the ambition is still there. Yeah. And you see this in the use of certain materials as well, which are less porous. So not using stone, not using brick, but using surfaces that are much easier to clean, right? Again, the surfaces of modernity, glass, concrete, steel, and so on. And this is a constant struggle in urban maintenance as well. Coating, recoating, cleaning, washing, brushing surfaces, scrubbing them. I do a list in the book of different actions, what is done to surfaces, and then what surfaces do as well. But these constant, repetitive sometimes gestures of maintenance, repair, coating, painting, buffing, they speak very much to this aspiration of cleanliness and also order. I think it's visual order, it's social order that gets signified through the clean surface as well. And they're powerful concepts. They continue to be very, very powerful concepts, despite graffiti being very much spread. Like you said, you were struck by it in New York a few years ago. Now it's like that, I would say, in many, if not all, major Western cities. What's happening in the global South is a very interesting story, and it's, my next area of research focus. But still, walls are full, despite of what we try to do to keep them clean and empty and pristine.
There's an interesting network diagram as well, because one of the things from my childhood, car spray was expensive, and obviously with the rise of the ubiquity of the types of spray paints, and the cheapening because they're made in the Far East and things have got cheaper. Those kinds of things have got cheaper. It's made it more possible. Like you couldn't, like car spray was so expensive when I was a kid. It was kind of like you looked after it. And also it was just incredibly poisonous. I think they've changed things around a bit. So there is a kind of interesting thing that sort of capitalism has driven the possibilities of its own kind of defacement through kind of globalization's productive capacity. It's kind of really interesting. But I kind of wanted to talk more about the semiotic aspects that you talk about as well. But this idea of the permeability of surfaces and the way that you're starting to you're looking at the surfaces as permeable rather than impermeable, I think is a really, really interesting point. That late modern contemporary idea that we've fetishized the red line, we've fetishized the idea of bounded objects. And graffiti to some degree reflects on the impossibility of that idea. That the absurdity, in fact, of that idea, and your mentioning of those scholars who've been talking about the intersection or the interaction between nature, mold, and algae, and seaweed, and whatever it is, and graffiti seems to speak of that as well. One
of the best revelations I had when I was doing research for this book was in London's Leake Street, which is the biggest legal graffiti spot in London. And I did research there. I visited that space over 100 consecutive days to take photos of the same. I chose kind of like 10 different frames. It's quite a long tunnel. So I made some marks on the floor, and I knew where I had to stop every day. And I took these photos over 100 consecutive days. And it was fantastic because the walls kept changing almost on a daily basis, if not on a daily basis. And then what that got me to think, and actually was able to grab and examine, was, what does this do to the materiality of the space? Because imagine, like, of course, these are very, very thin layers of spray paint that we're talking about, but in hundreds and thousands, and imagine this has been going on for years, of accumulated layers, surely this becomes an object. It becomes a span. It's a thickness, right? And I remember so well, one day going to the tunnel, it had rained a lot, and there was like kind of a line of water trickling down one of the walls, and it had kind of seeped through the paint. And I was able to kind of grab a slab of these accumulated layers, and it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I kept because it was like a 2 inches thick slab of surface that was made through contamination, like it's materials contaminating right with the previous layer and the next layer. And it's also, it kind of gave me the best material evidence for the concepts that I had in my head for such a long time. And it allowed me to demonstrate that surfaces are new spaces. They are not spaces that belong to the building, because in the friction that happens between building and elements and writing and semiotics, communication, signage, and so on, a new space is made. And that new space, the urban surface, what I call it, and which has a semiotics, that has a legal condition, a material condition, a moral condition of its own. So, and that was amazing because I took that object with me to conferences for like 3 years after that. And I was, using object-based teaching in class. And because that object captured so many questions, it captured who owns this? How was this made? What is the authorship of this? Because again, it goes back to it's co-authored. Yeah. All of them are co-authored. And the friction, the contamination there, I think is key. And I think it's key also as a guiding principle for us to think about urban life and the other and coexisting, because there's a constant contamination. Yes, we might want to say we want to keep a certain kind of civility and order, and we want our cities to look in a certain way, and we will invest and we will govern through images in certain ways to make sure that we project an image of the city, an urban brand, right? But this will keep happening. And you can see these contaminations by examining surfaces. So it's powerful. There's a lot to see.
The word you're using, contamination, is interesting as well. I mean, it's a really good description that you've given of this kind of idea of in a way, the impossibility of surfaces. They're not surface, because surface implies two-dimensionality. And these are not. These are temporal, and in the case of Leek Street, they're physically thick. But this idea of contamination speaks of a kind of political character to it. And obviously, I think most of us, when we think about graffiti, if we think about graffiti and the history of it, it's connected in our imaginations to kind of urban subcultures in places like New York, Detroit, Chicago, and certain music scenes and certain socio-demographic groups and so on. And then you get the occasional people pointing back to saying, no, I found some graffiti in Pompeii, and then there seems to be a leap from Pompeii to about 1972, and nothing happened in between that. Oh, an occasional little inscription in a Gothic cathedral by some bored choir boy. Yeah, so I'm kind of interested in this history, the historiography of graffiti. I'm interested in this idea of the scholarship around it, but I think you've touched on that sufficiently. But I'm really interested in this idea of semiotics that you keep coming back to. So I was wondering, could you position graffiti as a phenomenon, and then could you talk a little bit more about this idea of sign functioning or semiotics?
Can I start with the semiotics question?
Yeah, why not?
I first came across semiotics while I was studying comparative literature. It was in our class of literary theory, and we had a very good professor, I remember, who inspired me a lot. And, he taught us linguistic semiotic theories and also explained to us how semiotics is the study of how meaning gets formed and, mostly how this happens in language. But there was one of the semiotic theories that I encountered then that belongs to an American semiotician, Charles Peirce. He's one of the founders of semiotics. And it's a theory that basically says that there are 3 types of signs. Signs that are indexical, which means that they have a connection of proximity with whatever they signify. So the arrow, for example, right? Signs that are iconic. So it's a depiction of that resembles the object, the signifier, what they're trying to signify. So for example, a picture of a landscape representing the landscape. And then signs that are symbolic, that have absolutely nothing to do with what they stand for, and they are quite random associations. And this, I remember, since I was studying this, as I said, during my undergrad, but more recently, when I was, again, doing research for the book, I came across this theory of geosemiotics. And what geosemiotics argued was that in this Pearson logic of these three types of signs, what we miss is the fact that all signs are indexes, which means that we cannot understand the meaning of any sign unless we look at its context, unless we understand it in an in-placed way. And this to me was a very good moment of kind of opening up and finding usefulness in this theory. For anyone who's dealt with semiotics, the problem is that all semioticians tend to complicate the theoretical, kind of conceptual language of it a lot. So there's like a lot of complicated words and it gets very convoluted and cumbersome. But to me, just this idea that, okay, we cannot understand the meaning of signs unless we look at their context. Take this, apply it to what you see in the street, and you'll realize that the same thing, the same word, the same sticker or tag means very different things in different contexts, whether we perceive it having been authorized or not, whether there is a certain political context in which it appears. There are many, many ways in which we can create difference and understand meaning nuance through semiotics. So I wanted to kind of broaden the methodological meaning of this. And so I worked a lot with these categories that make up the first chapter of the book, mostly with visibility, thinking about the politics of visibility and how that is, being visible, invisible, visibilizing and not what makes a certain type of sign more prominent, what's the intention behind it being more prominent or not. But also with materiality, which I thought was a new addition in terms of doing a semiotic analysis. So looking at the materials that make up the surface and how they work together with each other. And there's a lot of examples in the book, mostly through the form of images. So I've taken, and I continue to take, a lot of photos. It's kind of the way I understand the world in many ways. And then you will have seen throughout the book, I try to make these inscriptions on the photos many times to kind of explain different aspects of what I see or how I can unpack, how I read that surface. So that's the process of a semiotic analysis there.
A really interesting idea. It's almost like you're crossing this linguistic tactic or literature with the area. I mean, it seems very phenomenological. It certainly seems to be connected closely. I did a podcast reasonably recently with a woman called Katie Lloyd-Thomas and her book on materials. And likewise, and it was something that you said at the beginning when we were just talking about the kind of material turn and the materiality of the city becoming in its own way a signifier. So it's kind of two really interesting things for me, moving beyond the learning from Las Vegas, kind of darker decorated shed, semiotic, like what is this saying, moving into both the contextualization of the sign, but then also digging down into the actual fabric of the sign itself. And in the case of graffiti, trying to understand that, I think is a really, it's sort of like it's got characteristics of this idea of palimpsest, like you become the person that's starting to peel back the layers of the city to understand sign value over time.
Can I just leave it there because you put it beautifully?
Oh, wow.
Yes. But yeah, I just wanted to say the idea of the palimpsest was very useful for me from the beginning. And I very much feel like I imagine, and I'm sure this can be done, working with an archaeologist and literally, also through the principle of learning about cultures through their material traces. But of course, we would do that in a contemporary setting. But, literally peeling off layers and seeing what's under. But this can be done in real time, so to speak, through this method that I applied in Leek Street and that other graffiti scholars are using as well with repeat photography, or like what others call a longitudinal documentation of a space, where you revisit it at certain intervals. I did it daily, but this could take years. And then you observe, because of course some of the layers of this palimpsest are also subtractive layers, not additive layers, which means that matter is being removed, scrubbed away. And many times when graffiti removal workers are working specifically on certain types of materials, they do work with this subtractive method, but this can also damage the supporting surface, the supporting material a lot. So it's a very, very fascinating area of practice to look at, and the knowledge that these people have about the materials of our city, and also about how graffiti works and where it goes, and the good guys and the bad guys, are quite remarkable. And it's one of the projects that I'm working on right now, which is an ethnography with graffiti removal companies and workers to understand how they see the city and how they see their role as well, but also the knowledges and the very embodied knowledges they have as well about the city.
Graffiti is obviously tied to a certain idea, and you've touched on this, of a political kind of identity. And there's something about in the book about the notion of graffiti as a political and act that is about, to some degree, demanding a form of representation or recognition in public space that counters the hegemonic ideas of what a city is or what a city should be. It's about claiming rights to the city, I suppose. And I was thinking, when I was reading it, about David Schlossberg's ideas around environmental justice. And it's a paper that I read when I was doing my PhD. Can't remember the name of the paper now. It's really good. As I remember it, and my memory is, not perfect on this, he talks about three kind of key components to environmental justice, which is recognition, representation, and rights. And so is there in your work with graffiti artists and work in observing graffiti, is there a sense that what graffiti is fundamentally orientated towards is expressing and legitimizing discrepant voices of the graffiti artists? Or is it indifferent to that and is simply an act of aesthetic practice? Or is it something in between?
It's all of this and more. I don't want to be reductive, because I think, particularly from the practitioner's point of view, it means very different things to different people. But the way I read it is a form of spatial production. And here I'm being Lefebvrean. I'm using the Lefebvrean mode of spatial production as social affirmation. And this is where I link not just graffiti, but any practice of mark making and the discrepant totality of urban mark making to this idea of the right to the city. Because the fact that there are, as we said, right, new spaces, new thicknesses produced in this act of inscription and in the act of removal. So these are, they're very similar operations, removal and inscription, and they mirror each other. So I think, this whole process of writing on the surface, cleaning it, and so on, no matter the intentions of the actors who are involved in it, the process itself is, I think, a very important example of spatial production in the city and of producing a mode of urban inhabitation that is multiple and that is agonistic. And that allows for us to disagree, basically, because we always will about this. And that's what's beautiful, I think, in many ways for me about graffiti, that there's no end, there's no bottom line. Okay, we solved it. We came up with a better way to manage it as a municipality. We cleaned off all the graffiti, and the New York subway fleet is now free of graffiti for 3 seconds. We decided that we want to decriminalize it and, make our city a graffiti mecca through festivals or something like that. Like, all of these kind of approaches that try to solve this in one way will fail, because writing on surfaces mirrors the diversity and the divergence of urban life. And that's why I think it's also a very reliable source of learning. Surfaces taught me everything I know about cities. It's a very reliable source of learning because it's not controlled by any single voice. It's always multiple voices.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. I remember a few years ago, there was some story about some kids stabbing each other in London because one of them had tagged over another one's tag, and it was seen as being kind of some form of Romeo and Juliet-like diss. I really like this idea of the political idea of it. I think that's really interesting. And it is interesting also to me that to try and better understand why it is unacceptable when we're very comfortable with local authorities mandating the covering of urban surfaces with corporate advertising. And during the COVID fiasco, covering everything with signage, visual clutter, often deeply unaesthetic, and often, interestingly, and I think COVID was quite an interesting one, because often also incredibly alarming imagery, which was fine. That was fine. And in fact, removing those signs, that was a crime. And no one's permitted, no one's been polled about, do we want adverts on the London Underground? Or do we want adverts outside schools for hamburgers? And yet graffiti is this totally naughty thing.
So this is something that has been preoccupying me more and more recently, and I'm trying to address it through a framework that I now call visual justice, urban visual justice. So in the same way that we speak about spatial justice as a struggle for the affirmation, I want to say, of bodies, of subjectivities in space on their own terms, and a struggle for equitable access to resources. If we translate this to the visual world and think about, like you say, how the ways in which authorities govern through images are very skewed to deeply problematic types of images, not to even mention the fact that most of this advertising, all of the advertising that we see in public space, also extracts financial value from the surface. So any poster, any billboard, that company will make money from the surface. Whereas this never happens with tags. And it's one of the things that I'm really confronted by right now here in Melbourne. Because I've been working together with a colleague, Chris Parkinson, on a research project with street poster companies. It's a very big thing here in Melbourne. The street level posters, and they're framed in these really neat, like, wooden frames on the sides of buildings. And local councils here turn a blind eye to this practice, which literally occupies the majority of available surfaces in the city, and also holds very important kind of cultural archives of the city. It's a very interesting universe. All of these should technically have planning permission, and none of them do, or very few do, because councils turn a blind eye to the advertising because there's no more space for tags on these walls. So the pecking order, tags and graffiti are seen still as such a threat, although kind of maybe a bit in the background, they can offer some sort of vibe to a desired image of the city, but they are still perceived as a massive threat. And I think very, very problematically, still criminalized not only as images, but also the individuals who create them are still criminalized because of this. And I think this is really problematic. We should really have a bigger picture perspective here on who are the real thieves and destroyers and vandals. And yeah, look to the multinational billboard advertising companies. It is insane how much power they have and how much influence they have on not just urban atmospheres and experiences, but also I think on our well-being and, like very individually and intimately as well. And people often speak about graffiti as kind of a violent image or a violent act, but we should think much more about the others as being more violent because they come from a position of power. Graffiti is not done from a position of power.
No. A last point to finish on, I suppose, and you've suggested, say, for example, at Leek Street, and you've talked about it, I suppose, obliquely in with regards to what's going on in Melbourne and your ongoing research there. This idea of the co-option of this practice, this aesthetic practice, this material practice, by people in positions of authority and power, as in some ways to control it, in some ways to aestheticize it, and I suppose in that process of aestheticization, disempower it. And obviously the go-to example would be Banksy. And you can't, I suppose, these days have conversation about graffiti without mentioning him, her, them, whoever it is, because they're so famous and they've made so much money off this thing. One assumes. And I remember when Banksy popped up I remember there was I can't remember what the magazine was called. It was like a little free zine or a little cheap zine in that when I lived in London, and it would sometimes feature Banksy's work, and it was like cool. And now it's in art galleries and is part of the kind of new art scene. Does that kind of exposure and that kind of co-option of graffiti through these main practitioners, does it somehow disempower the normal graffiti artist, the everyday spray can wielding, felt tip pen wielding tagger? Is it sort of another victory of the capitalist system where it's kind of paid for, bought, and now owns, in that Foucaultian way, owns the logic of graffiti as something that they are fundamentally in control of?
Again, I'm going to say what I said earlier, there is not one logic. Yes, everything you just said, the capitalist co-option of it exists. There are disgusting examples of this. There are also inspiring examples of education. And in fact, I can mention one that I've recently seen. There is an exhibition in Paris on right now, and I think it's on until June at the Grand Palais. It could not get more establishment than this. And it's an incredible exhibition called, I think it's called Urban Art in the Digital Age. And it proposes completely new models of displaying graffiti or like looking at graffiti as an urban object. And it's mostly through film. And it's really remarkable. So this is an example of, okay, yes, in the cultural field of graffiti discourse, it's an example of the co-option by intellectual establishments, right? art establishments, cultural institutions, and so on. Yes, that's possible at the same time as having tags in the street that don't comply, don't respond, don't have any relation, don't give a shit, couldn't care less about any of this. It will keep happening all the time. And I just 2 days ago, I saw a great sticker on a street next to my house here in Melbourne, and I and I think it could be a cool thing to maybe end on or leave you with. So there used to be this campaign. One of the ways in which authorities were trying to tackle graffiti in the 70s in New York was they were securitizing the train layouts and so on, but they tried to do like public education campaigns, right? And one of them had this slogan that said, "Leave your mark in society, not on society," right? And so the other day, I was walking here in my neighborhood in Brunswick in Melbourne, and I saw this sticker that said, "Make your mark on society, not in society. Graffiti keeps the rent low. Thank your local vandal."
That's very good. We said before we recorded, though, about the reception to how has the reception to the book been? How have you found things shaping up since it's come out?
I've had a lot of fun since the book has come out because I've taken it with me everywhere. I have my own copy, which by now is quite like beaten up, and I've taken it with me everywhere and photographed it. I've been showing it to the places that inspired it, and I've been photographing the book. I place it in surface contexts, and I tape it to the wall, and I just see where it fits, and like I've been photographing it, and it's been amazing to see it become an object in the city and to see it become one of these signs that it talks about. So this has been a really interesting reflection process for me in terms of what, where does this book belong? Who is it for? How can I use it now? How can other people use it? And so I took it like on tour. So I did like some launches and events in Europe the other month, and it was a lot of fun and very engaging and stimulating and very encouraging for me as well, that there seems to be very good reception for the book. But one of the most exciting things for me that I've done was I worked with my friend who's a designer, Sonia Sanchez Lopez, and we designed 2 street posters for the book. And with the help of my friends in London and Manchester, and soon in Melbourne as well, these posters have gone up on the street, but again, in ways that I couldn't control, because they were placed in the networks of existing postering companies. So they did it. And it was the most amazing thing because so there's one poster that went up in London and Manchester that has it's A0 format, and it has a photo of the book cover, but quite small. And then the poster just says, "Read in the sheets, write in the streets." And since that went up, I've been receiving so many emails. Like every day I get emails from strangers with photos of these posters and saying, "Oh my God, this is very cool. Like I just found this." And then someone wrote, "Write bollocks" or something on the poster. And again, it's a super interesting thing for me because it kind of closes the circle, brings the book back, puts it back in its place in the best way possible.
Fantastic. That's a great point to finish on. Thank you very, very much, Sabina. It was lovely to talk to you. It's a great book.
Thank you. This was fun. I really enjoyed this chat.
You pick your way past young men and girls sitting on the steps,
You wander bewildered among those austere walls which students' hands have arabesqued with outsized capital writing and detailed graffiti, just as the cavemen felt the need to decorate the cold walls of their caves to become masters of the tormenting mineral alienness, to make them familiar, empty them into their own inner space, annex them to the physical reality of living. Well, that's what Italo Calvino thought anyway, but I'm not so sure. Thank you to Sabina for taking the time to talk to me, and to Routledge for the book. It's excellent. You should get it. Links to Sabina and to the book are in the podcast description as ever. And thanks for listening.